Hello, everybody. You are watching The Political Vigilante. My name is Graham Elwood. I want to bring back to the show. It's been a little while since he's been on the show. MMT economist and expert. We're going to talk about all this stuff with the economy and all this stuff. Let's bring him back to the show, ladies and gentlemen. Fidel Kaboub. Fidel, how you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, dude, thanks. I'm sorry it took so long. I know I emailed you a while ago to come back on the show.
It's okay. You're waiting for a pandemic. I understand.
It's like, yes, I can't have Fidel on until we have a pandemic. So I wanted to bring you on the show because there's obviously a lot has happened since we spoke last. I have a whole MMT playlist. But as this pandemic has been going on, we're seeing several things happening that I really want to get you to comment on. First of all, we see a pending economic collapse because of the shutdown, because of the unemployment, because of evictions, because of all that stuff. And I'm sure you can get into more detail on that. We've got, 30 million evictions that are looming. We've got 15 million people that have lost their health care because they had it through their employer and they've been laid off through COVID-19. We've seen the federal government print more money than they have like almost ever, which is a thing like that MMT is about. Oh, we don't need to raise taxes. We can print our way out of it, or we can, like a Green New Deal. Last time I had you on the show, we talked about a Green New Deal and how MMT could help that. But a lot of economists, financial people that I'm watching are saying all this money printing is not good. It's going to cause the collapse. And then we're also seeing, I've started to pay more attention to cryptocurrency. I'm by no means an expert, but I've been watching for about 6 months. I've even done a little investing. As of today, Bitcoin has broken another record of 22,000, I believe. So I really wanted to get your take on where you all this printing that the federal government is doing, how that's going to affect the economy, and then also where do you see cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, in that equation?
Okay, so lots of things on the table. So let's start with a couple of basic things to explain what's been happening and what is the potential. You're right. This is a crisis. It's a pandemic and a pandemic-induced economic crisis. What MMT is saying is the following. We're saying that most mainstream economists, mainstream politicians believe that the spending capacity of the federal government is small, is limited. It's limited by tax revenues, is limited by the borrowing capacity from financial markets. And MMT is saying that spending capacity is actually much, much larger than that. It's not unlimited. And I always say it twice just to make sure anybody missed it. It's not unlimited spending capacity. So nobody in the MMT community is saying, print your way out of this without any constraints. So what are the limits that MMT emphasizes? And this is where it gets political and it gets really important. The risk of inflation is the main constraint on the government's capacity to spend, the federal government capacity. States, municipalities, you and I are constrained with our revenues, but the federal government doesn't have that constraint. So then what determines that inflation risk? It's two things. One is easy to deal with. The other one is political. It has to do with corruption. It has to do with power of corporations and so on. So the easy one is the risk of inflation can happen when we exceed the productive capacity of the economy. In other words, if we run out of machines and equipment and skilled people, we hit the inflation barrier. And that's where we know that more spending will cause inflation. The good news about that is that productive capacity is producible. We can train more doctors. We can build more hospitals. We can produce more machinery and equipment and all that. And it creates millions of jobs and it allows us to thrive as a society. And that's part of the Green New Deal philosophy is that. The second risk of inflation is really where it gets complicated. And this is the scary part for people in the establishment, for corporations, because the bigger risk of inflation has to do with powerful corporations who can raise prices and cause inflation simply because they can, because they have too much market power, and because lawmakers let them, because they're not regulated. And here I'm talking about big pharma, Wall Street, big tech, all of the companies that have very little competition and they have so much abusive pricing behavior in the economy. So that kind of inflation risk is not going to go away by creating misery for the rest of us, by imposing austerity. It only goes away if you tax and regulate their market power out of existence. And for that, you need 535 people in DC who actually do their job. And if they are embracing what democracy is supposed to be, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, they'll do their job and they'll allow us that additional spending capacity. But if they're doing their job for the super PACs that actually, put them in office, that's the power that suffocates the U.S. economy right now. It's the power of the super PACs. It's the corrupt system between corporate America and some of the 535 people in office who are not serving the people, but serving the interest of the 1%. So this is what MMT is saying. It's just describing what the system looks like and saying MMT is already being applied, so to speak, for the interest of the 1%. What we're saying is apply the power of the purse, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, in order to produce better quality jobs, living wages, in order to provide economic relief during a pandemic. And last time we talked about MMT on this show, I had to go all the way back to World War II to bring you an example that says, this is it. This is how the government can have massive spending capacity without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country, without a slippery slope to communism. That was the big war effort, going from the Great Depression, the most miserable time, to funding World War II. This time I don't have to do that. I can just go back 8 months to the CARES Act. Remember a week before or 2 weeks before the CARES Act was passed, everybody in DC was convinced there is no money for the Green New Deal. There's no money for Medicare for all. There's no money for any of that. There's only money for tax cuts and for military budgets and all that. And then all of a sudden, 535 people get together and vote to approve the CARES Act, and trillions of dollars came into existence. And they didn't tell us who they taxed to make that happen, who they borrowed from, because they didn't. It's actually worse than that. Trump and Mnuchin showed up the same week and said, by the way, April 15th is around the corner. That's when you usually send taxes to the federal government. Guess what? We don't need your taxes. We're postponing that to July 15th. Just to show you that when there is the political will, when we set the priorities straight, we can spend on national priorities. We can provide economic relief. So that's what MMT is saying. It's not saying print all the way and make sure that it runs to the top 1%. It's saying there's a different way of tweaking the system using the democratic process to serve the interest of the people, the interest of the climate, to provide reparations for slavery, reparations for Native Americans. All of these things are affordable, but we have to democratize the system. And I always joke and say, it's not enough to have pitchforks upset at the government and corporations. You have to have well-informed pitchforks who can call their bluff, because they're constantly saying, oh, we don't have money. We ran out of money. It's going to bankrupt the country. So all of those economists we referred to in the beginning when they said was going to bankrupt the country and cause inflation, they were wrong about inflation. They were wrong about inequality. They're wrong about climate change. They're wrong about everything. And yet they're convinced that using the principles that MMT is describing is going to be dangerous, right?
That's a great point. And thank you. That's why I want to have you on the show to clarify this. It is something I have talked about on the show. In the CARES Act, I think it was $4.25 trillion that went to Wall Street and banks. And your point is, it's a thing I've talked about with you and other MMT people, is had that $4.25 trillion been spent on rent forgiveness, not postponing it, but we're just going to pay your rent for 6 months. Had that money been spent on everybody gets Medicare for all now. We're in a pandemic. Everybody gets free healthcare. Student debt forgiveness, Medicare for all those things. And we could put people to work, making PPE or whatever kind of things that are directly needed during this pandemic, giving bonuses or forcing companies to give hazard pay to frontline workers and stuff like that. And so I guess if I understand this correctly, the printing of money that can cause an economic collapse is not the MMT for good things that you're talking about, that we're talking about. It's giving right now, and you can go into the details on this. As I understand it, giving all this money to Wall Street, we're pumping, there's all these debt bubbles that have been expanding prior to the pandemic. And now this stimulus, which really is for the 1%, it's not for the American people, that is creating the house of cards for the economic collapse. Is that right? Did I have that right?
The house of cards has to do with unsustainable debt for households, unsustainable debt for businesses. But the debt for the national government, for the federal government, is not the same thing as my debt to my bank, because the federal government is indebted in its own currency. It can create its own currency to meet its debt payment at any time. So that's not the debt that we worry about. That's not the deficit that we should worry about. We should worry about the infrastructure deficits, the public health deficits, the educational deficits, the social justice deficits. Those are the deficits that matter. And the monetary deficits, when it comes to student debt, when it comes to household debt, especially after the pandemic, all of those payments that have been put on hold, they're going to be due in 2 weeks and thousands of dollars, and people that have no resources to do that. So the biggest debt of all is the climate debt. That's the biggest financial collapse in the history of the universe that's going to happen. And I don't know if people notice this, but the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, for the first time in the history of the Fed, mentioned climate change and risks to financial markets about a month ago. And this Monday, I think, or Tuesday, the Fed announced that it's joining an international organization of central banks and financial regulators that was started in Europe. And the Fed was never part of it until Monday. And the purpose of this organization is called NGFS. And I forget what the acronym is. I keep saying I need to look it up. It's a network of central banks and financial regulators who are worried about the impact of climate change on financial markets. And they're trying to design central bank policies to green the financial system and to impose restrictions that will nudge the system towards addressing climate change. Mm-hmm. So what is this biggest financial market bubble? It's about, depending on who you ask, 20, maybe $30 trillion at least of financial assets that will go poof at some point in the future. So here's an example. Imagine all the coastal real estate properties all over the world, in the US and all over the world, all those hotels and resorts and beautiful buildings and stores and businesses and restaurants, all of those will be flooded either occasionally or on a permanent basis with the impact of climate change. So their value goes from trillions of dollars all the way down to zero. Imagine the infrastructure, the oil and gas infrastructure that is worth hundreds of billions of dollars today around the world, and that is priced in the value of those companies in the stock market as assets that will produce revenues for the next 30, 40, 50 years. When climate change hits and those assets are physically destroyed or become literally obsolete as we transition to other resources, renewable energy resources, their value will go from trillions of dollars all the way down to zero. They're called stranded assets. Stranded assets are worth nothing. So we're talking about assets across the system, and most of those assets are owned by companies in the global north, in the US and Europe and Japan and so on. So if the financial system doesn't gradually step away from those investments, step away from those assets, they're going to be hit by those losses. And it's the governments who are backing up those companies that will be facing this risk. Now, here's the killer. All of this stuff has been known for a long while, and investment bankers have always kept silent and completely ignored it until about a year or two ago. Especially last year, we started hearing from major investment banks around the world, including here in the US. They're saying we need to take into account the financial risks associated with climate change. And internal documents, they refer to the IPCC report, which most people thought was outrageously shocking. They refer to it as extremely optimistic. So they know what's coming, right? So this is the major climate crisis that we're dealing with. It's actually an economic crisis, not just the end of our existence on the planet. So there's some good news here. The fact that they're freaking out, that central bankers are freaking out, there's an opportunity that maybe the interest of the climate movement, the social justice movement, is now at least to some extent aligned with the interest of Wall Street and insurance companies who are panicking about their investments. So maybe we can take this opportunity to accelerate the transition, not just here in the US, but globally, because climate crisis is in the global south too. So the climate debt is also a debt to developing countries in the global south, because they didn't contribute to this crisis. If anything, they're on the receiving end of this crisis. And plus, most of the natural resources have been extracted from the global south. So I've been arguing for climate reparations. That is the global north transferring financial resources and technological resources to accelerate the transition in the global south with economic and social justice to create millions of jobs around the world, to help us collectively as a globe transition away from this. If you want to add another layer to it, we can spend another 10 minutes talking about colonial reparations that is also owed to the global south. So there's a legal, ethical, moral, economic case to be made for massive transfer of resources, financial resources, from the power of the purse of countries like the US, who actually have plenty of spending capacity that's being suffocated right now by the 1%, hijacked by the 1%, to fight climate change and to introduce social justice and economic justice around the world. And I'll close with just one number just to show you that none of this is going to happen unless we address these things at a global level. It's not enough to do it in the US. If you take the whole world, rich countries and poor countries, let's call them global north and global south, and you net out all the financial transactions that happen throughout the year, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, interest payments, debt payments, you name it, charity, contributions, all of that, you find that $2 trillion a year are moving from the global south, the poorest countries, to the global north. And that number has been constantly increasing for the last 3 decades. It was $500 billion 20 years ago. It was $1 trillion about 10 years ago. Now it's $2 trillion a year of extraction of wealth from the poorest countries. And if we don't do anything about it in the form of climate reparations, colonial reparations, to repair the damage, we'll have this conversation in 5 years and it'll be 3, 4, maybe $5 trillion, because that's what the system does. It sucks wealth and resources from the poorest people, from the poorest communities around the world. And that's just unsustainable, again, politically, economically, ethically, ecologically. The system will break down. So this is the system breakdown that I think about. It's not limited to the US or Wall Street, or certainly not related to the US government debt.
Okay, so then, I mean, obviously this feels like this CARES Act had just accelerated this upward transfer of money. So with all of these sort of looming economic things, going back, so when the stock market crashed in 29, the depression wasn't really felt in this country till about 31 or 32. So do you see some type of economic collapse coming soon in America? Because obviously the markets all crashed in March when they shut everything down, right? So then do you see something like that happening? Because we've got all of these sort of looming bubbles, and the federal government is not, well, they're not using MMT to help people. They're just using it for the percent or whatever. So, I mean, what do you see happening?
Yeah, I don't think there'll be a massive collapse unless we uncover some major scandal, something like the SNL crisis, or the 2008 financial crisis, some major fraud that hasn't been discovered yet. But in terms of macroeconomic variables and what the government does, even a conservative government run by Republicans, especially on the Fed side, on the Wall Street side, they always step up to bail out the system. They let go of 1 or 2 companies to teach them a lesson, but they really bail out the system, because we've learned the lesson from the Great Depression, that if you step away and let the system cleanse itself, you end up in the Great Depression. The question is, who do you bail out? Who do you prioritize? And when do you stop? Where do you stop the recovery effort? And this is my concern about the Biden administration. It's definitely going to be, I hate to use the word, more progressive than the Trump administration, depending on what happens in Georgia. But my concern is that they're not going to go all the way to full recovery and relief. They're going to provide substantial relief. They're going to invest in infrastructure, but they're going to be constantly worried about what the Republicans will say about them. They're going to call them communists. They're going to call them socialists. They're going to bankrupt the country and all of that. So they are going to stop too soon, too short, which means it's almost guaranteed that this recovery is going to be as slow, as painful, if not more, than the 2008 recovery of the Obama administration. Remember, most people in 2015, 2016, working class people, they say, well, you tell us that the recession was over, but it sure feels like it's still a recession. right? And by the time we get to 2017 and 18, and economists are saying we're at full employment, this is it, and the majority of people say, well, we've been in a recession since 2008, and you tell us this is full employment. So I think this is what's going to happen with the Biden administration, which confirms again my personal feelings and many other people's feelings about the need for a bolder, more progressive Democratic Party, more progressive movement in terms of presence in Congress. The Bernie movement did great, given where we started. We started with almost nothing, essentially 10 years ago, and now we have a social movement, including people in Congress like Cori Bush, like Jamal Bowman, AOC, and others. We're not at the tipping point yet for this movement to dominate and to actually impose its agenda, but I feel like we're close. I feel like we need to keep pushing and not compromise with Republicans or with the Biden administration on core principles. We have to set fire under their feet and keep pushing for things that are actually extremely popular. When you think about Medicare for all, the majority of people support this. Who oppose it? It's the elected officials in DC, their lobbyists, the super PACs that support them, and the media companies that spin their stories. These are the only people who oppose it. The majority of the American people want a Medicare for all system.
Which is why it's so puzzling to me that AOC won't force the vote force the vote with Nancy Pelosi, that strategy that Jimmy Dores proposed, because it's going to take drastic action. This like incremental centrism, I want to believe that, AOC and the squad and them are going to really be progressives that are fighting, but I just see them acquiesce to the corporate Democrats at every turn. So I don't know. I hope that happens, but they seem to they don't realize how drastic the situation is, and they just keep they're like you say, they're worried the Republicans are going to call them communists, or they're worried about this or that. It's like AOC has 10 million Twitter followers. She could fucking write whatever. She could do whatever the hell she wants, and she should. And she's like, worried about, we're going to.
And Republicans call the corporate Democrats socialist anyway.
I know. It's like hilarious. They're calling. I was like, God, I wish Joe Biden was a socialist. Instead, he's a Republican. So, well, that's interesting that's your take on it. I worry that there is going to be some sort of market crash or something like that. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button. Go to patreon.com/Graham Elwood and rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, where you can support the show. Also, I have a Bitcoin wallet, a Bitcoin Cash wallet, and an Ethereum wallet in the show notes. We're taking cryptocurrency. I have a Coinbase affiliation link. We're going to be getting on some other exchanges. So that's how you support the show. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. YouTube is unsubscribing us at an alarming rate. I have a PayPal button at GrahamElwood.com. I even have a Venmo at Graham-Elwood. There's a lot of ways to support our show. We are getting crushed by YouTube. We've dipped under 73,000 subscribers because of YouTube. Thanks for supporting what we do.